King Edward I, early years, 1239 to 1263. King Edward I of England, also known as Edward Longshanks and the Hammer of the Scots, was one of the most influential monarchs of the medieval period. His early years, spanning from his birth in 1239 to his assumption of power in 1263, laid the foundation for his later accomplishments and shaped his character as a ruler. Let's explore Edward's formative years, his upbringing, political influences, and the key events that defined this phase of his life. Birth and family background. Edward was born on June 17, 1239, at the Palace of Westminster, to King Henry III of England and Eleanor of Provence. As the eldest son, he was heir to the English throne, a position that came with immense responsibility and expectations. His namesake, Edward the Confessor, reflected his father's reverence for the saintly king, whose legacy influenced Henry III's reign. Edward's early years were marked by the privilege of royal life, but also the tensions of a kingdom frequently beset by political unrest. Edward's birth came at a time of heightened tensions within the realm. King Henry III's reign was fraught with challenges, including disputes with the barons over royal prerogatives and the financial burdens of the monarchy. From a young age, Edward was exposed to the realities of governance through the lens of his father's struggles. Observing the delicate balance required to maintain authority amidst internal dissent and external threats gave Edward early insights into the complexities of ruling. Eleanor of Provence, Edward's mother, played a crucial role in his early upbringing. Known for her intelligence, diplomatic skills, and influence at court, Eleanor ensured that Edward and his siblings received a comprehensive education. Her Provençal heritage brought a touch of continental sophistication to the English court, exposing Edward to diverse cultural and intellectual traditions. Additionally, Eleanor's strong-willed nature and ability to navigate court politics likely served as a model for Edward's own political acumen. Edward's siblings further contributed to his formative environment. His sisters, Margaret and Beatrice, married into prominent European royal houses, strengthening England's diplomatic ties. These alliances provided Edward with opportunities to engage with continental politics from a young age, broadening his understanding of European diplomacy and statecraft. His younger brother, Edmund Crouchback, shared in their rigorous upbringing, fostering a sense of familial duty and collaboration that would persist throughout Edward's life. Education and upbringing. Edward's education was meticulously designed to prepare him for kingship. Tutors and mentors instilled in him the principles of chivalry, emphasizing honor, loyalty, and martial prowess. His training in the art of war included mastery of weaponry, strategy, and horsemanship, all of which would later define him as a formidable military leader. This focus on martial skills was complemented by lessons in governance, law, and diplomacy, ensuring that Edward developed a well-rounded understanding of his future responsibilities. The influence of his father, Henry III, was evident in Edward's exposure to architectural and cultural endeavors. Henry's passion for building projects, such as the reconstruction of Westminster Abbey, left a lasting impression on Edward. This early exposure to monumental architecture likely inspired Edward's later initiatives in fortifying castles and creating iconic structures that symbolized royal authority. Edward's religious education also played a significant role in shaping his character. Under the guidance of prominent clerics, he studied theology and scripture, fostering a deep sense of piety. This spiritual foundation not only influenced his personal beliefs but also informed his approach to governance. Edward's ability to leverage the church as a political ally while maintaining his authority would become a hallmark of his reign. Beyond formal education, Edward's upbringing included practical experiences that prepared him for leadership. As a young prince, he participated in courtly ceremonies, observed council meetings, and accompanied his father on royal progresses. These experiences allowed him to witness firsthand the intricacies of medieval governance, from negotiating with barons to managing disputes among the nobility. These lessons were invaluable in preparing him for the challenges he would later face as king. Early political influences. The political landscape of 13th-century England profoundly shaped Edward's early years. King Henry III's struggles with the barons over issues such as taxation and governance provided Edward with a front-row seat to the challenges of monarchy. The provisions of Oxford, 1258, marked a turning point, as the barons demanded reforms to curtail royal authority and establish a council to oversee the king's decisions. Edward's role during this period was complex, as he navigated the tensions between supporting his father and engaging with reformist ideals. One of the most significant figures in Edward's political development was Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. Initially a close ally of King Henry III, de Montfort later emerged as a leader of the baronial opposition. Edward's interactions with de Montfort were pivotal, exposing him to the dynamics of power struggles and the importance of balancing authority with the demands of the nobility. Although Edward's loyalties initially wavered, his eventual confrontation with de Montfort during the Barons' War solidified his resolve to uphold royal authority. Edward's travels across England and Europe further enriched his political education. These journeys exposed him to diverse governance systems and legal traditions, deepening his understanding of statecraft. His interactions with foreign courts, particularly in France and Castile, provided valuable insights into diplomacy and the complexities of international alliances. This exposure to a broader political landscape would later inform Edward's strategies as a ruler. Marriage to Eleanor of Castile. Edward's marriage to Eleanor of Castile in 1254 was both a political alliance and a personal partnership. The union strengthened ties between England and Castile, creating a strategic alliance that bolstered Edward's position on the European stage. The marriage also brought Edward into contact with the sophisticated culture of the Iberian Peninsula, influencing his tastes and broadening his perspective. Eleanor's role in Edward's life extended beyond that of a political consort. She was a trusted advisor and confidant, offering counsel on matters of governance and diplomacy. Their partnership was marked by mutual respect and affection, as evidenced by their correspondence and the many tributes Edward paid to her throughout their marriage. Eleanor's influence on Edward was profound, shaping his approach to leadership and reinforcing his commitment to family and duty. The marriage also had a lasting impact on Edward's cultural and architectural endeavors. Eleanor's Castilian heritage introduced him to new artistic and architectural styles, which he later incorporated into his own projects. The Eleanor crosses, erected by Edward in her memory after her death, stand as a testament to their enduring bond and his devotion to her legacy. Their marriage was a cornerstone of Edward's personal and political life, providing stability and strength during turbulent times. Military experience and the Barons' War. Edward's early military experiences were critical in shaping his leadership style and establishing his reputation as a warrior king. The Barons' War, 1264 to 1267, was a defining conflict in Edward's life, pitting royalist forces against the barons led by Simon de Montfort. Edward's initial capture at the Battle of Lewes in 1264 was a humbling experience, but his subsequent escape and decisive victory at the Battle of Evesham in 1265 demonstrated his resilience and strategic acumen. The Barons' War also highlighted Edward's ability to inspire loyalty among his troops and adapt to changing circumstances on the battlefield. His leadership during this conflict underscored his commitment to restoring royal authority and maintaining the integrity of the monarchy. These experiences laid the groundwork for his later military campaigns, including his conquests in Wales and Scotland. Beyond the battlefield, the Barons' War shaped Edward's understanding of governance. The conflict underscored the importance of balancing authority with the need for reform, a lesson that would inform his later efforts to strengthen the monarchy while addressing the demands of his subjects. Edward's military successes during this period solidified his reputation as a formidable leader and earned him the respect of both allies and adversaries. Crusading ambitions. The crusading spirit was a significant influence on Edward during his early years. In 1268, he took the cross, committing to participate in the Eighth Crusade. This decision reflected not only his devout faith but also his ambition to enhance his prestige on the international stage. Although his participation in the crusade would come later, the planning and preparation during his early years demonstrated his dedication to this cause. Edward's interest in the Crusades was shaped by his interactions with knights and nobles who had participated in earlier campaigns. These connections provided him with valuable insights into the logistical and strategic challenges of crusading, as well as the opportunities it presented for personal and political advancement. His commitment to the Crusades also reinforced his reputation as a pious and ambitious leader. The Crusades represented a synthesis of Edward's religious convictions and his desire for recognition on the global stage. Relationship with the Church. Edward's relationship with the Church was a defining aspect of his early years. Raised in a deeply religious environment, he developed a strong sense of piety and an understanding of the Church's influence in medieval society. His father's devotion to Edward the Confessor and his mother's piety further reinforced his spiritual formation. Throughout his early years, Edward demonstrated respect for ecclesiastical authority while also recognizing the Church's potential as a political ally. This pragmatic approach would later characterize his dealings with the clergy, as he sought to balance the interests of the Church with the needs of the monarchy. Edward's ability to navigate this complex relationship was a testament to his political acumen and strategic thinking. His religious education and early experiences with the Church helped shape his policies and interactions with religious institutions throughout his reign. The early years of King Edward I, from 1239 to 1263, were marked by significant personal and political developments. His education, marriage, military experiences, and exposure to the challenges of governance laid the groundwork for his future reign. These formative years shaped Edward into a complex and dynamic leader, whose legacy would be defined by his ambition, pragmatism, and enduring influence on the English monarchy. Edward's early years were not merely a prelude to his reign, but a critical period that forged the qualities that would define him as a king. His experiences as a prince navigating the turbulent political landscape of 13th-century England provided him with the skills and resilience needed to lead his kingdom through the challenges of his time. These formative years remain a testament to the enduring impact of early influences on the trajectory of a ruler's life. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious. King Edward I's early reign, 1274 to 1296, the conquest of Wales. Llewellyn ap Gruffydd emerged from the Barons' War as the dominant leader in Wales, strengthening his control over vast territories and solidifying his rule as Prince of Wales. His authority was officially acknowledged in the Treaty of Montgomery in 1267, which granted him control over lands he had seized in the Four Cantrefs of Porfedwlad. However, this diplomatic success did little to ease tensions with the powerful Marcher lords, including the Earl of Gloucester, Roger Mortimer, and Humphrey de Bohun, 3rd Earl of Hereford. These influential figures saw Llewellyn's growing power as a direct threat to their own territorial interests, leading to ongoing skirmishes and disputes. This hostility was further exacerbated by centuries of Anglo-Welsh conflicts, making long-term peace unattainable. Llewellyn's increasing assertion of independence, combined with his efforts to consolidate Welsh rule, positioned him as a formidable adversary to English expansionist ambitions. Edward I's motivations for the Welsh campaign. Edward I was a determined and ambitious monarch who sought to consolidate his rule over Britain. His campaign in Wales was part of a broader strategy to strengthen the English monarchy by securing its borders and eliminating threats. He viewed Llewellyn's refusal to do homage as an act of defiance and a challenge to royal authority. Additionally, Edward sought to secure vital trade routes and ensure the stability of his realm by bringing Wales under direct English control. His military background, including participation in the Ninth Crusade, had shaped his tactical approach and his belief in absolute rule, which played a crucial role in his decision to launch the Welsh campaign. Furthermore, Edward sought to establish a precedent for dealing with semi-independent territories, setting the stage for his later campaigns in Scotland and Ireland. The economic and political significance of Wales. Wales was not only a military target but also an economically valuable territory. Rich in natural resources, particularly timber and minerals, Wales had the potential to strengthen the English economy. Control over Welsh ports would allow England greater influence over trade routes in the Irish Sea, further integrating Wales into the English economic system. Additionally, the control of Wales allowed Edward to implement his feudal policies more effectively, ensuring loyalty through land grants and military service. Internal struggles and English provocation. Despite his outward strength, Llewellyn's leadership faced internal instability. In 1274, his own brother, Dafydd, alongside the influential Welsh Lord Gruffydd ap Gwenwyn of Prowess, attempted to assassinate him. When their plot failed, they sought refuge in England, gaining protection from King Edward I. Llewellyn regarded this as an outright betrayal, further exacerbated when Edward provided sanctuary and support to his enemies. When Edward demanded Llewellyn's formal homage, the Welsh prince refused, citing Edward's harboring of his adversaries as just cause. This diplomatic standoff escalated when Llewellyn sought to marry Eleanor de Montfort, the daughter of Simon de Montfort the Elder, a former rebel against the English monarchy. Edward viewed this alliance as an act of defiance and a direct challenge to his authority, pushing tensions to a breaking point. The role of the Church in the conquest. The Church played a significant role in Edward's campaign against Wales. While some clergy attempted to mediate peace, others supported Edward's efforts to bring Wales under English control. The Archbishop of Canterbury, John Peckham, sought to negotiate a resolution between Llewellyn and Edward, but his efforts failed. Edward also used the Church as a tool of assimilation, ensuring that English bishops replaced Welsh religious leaders and that ecclesiastical structures were aligned with English governance. Monasteries became centres of English influence, and the Church was used as a means to suppress Welsh cultural identity and reinforce English authority. Additionally, the construction of new churches and the reorganisation of dioceses were instrumental in extending English control into all aspects of Welsh life. Edward's first campaign, 1276 to 1277. By November 1276, negotiations had failed, and Edward declared war on Llewellyn. His military strategy was swift and overwhelming. Experienced commanders such as Roger Mortimer, Edmund, Earl of Lancaster, and William de Beauchamp spearheaded the English campaign, systematically isolating Llewellyn from his allies. By July 1277, Edward had assembled a force of 15,500 troops, including 9,000 Welsh soldiers loyal to the English crown. Despite the size of the force, Llewellyn was unable to muster sufficient resistance, and large-scale battles were avoided. With dwindling support and a vastly superior English army at his doorstep, Llewellyn was forced to surrender. The Treaty of Aberconwy, signed in November 1277, drastically curtailed his power, reducing his control to Gwynedd, although he was permitted to retain his title of Prince of Wales. The treaty marked the beginning of Edward's firm grip over Wales and set the stage for further conflict. The Welsh Revolt, 1282–1283. Despite Edward's victory, tensions remained high. By 1282, open rebellion erupted again, this time as a wider movement among the Welsh people. This conflict was not merely a territorial dispute, it was a battle for Welsh sovereignty, national identity, and the preservation of traditional laws. The uprising was sparked by Dafydd, who, despite previously aligning with Edward, became disillusioned with the limited rewards he had received. His defection was a catalyst for renewed conflict, and Llewellyn and other Welsh nobles quickly joined the rebellion, viewing it as their final opportunity to resist English encroachment. However, unlike previous conflicts, this war saw more organized resistance, with Welsh forces utilizing the mountainous terrain to their advantage and launching a series of coordinated attacks against English forces. The long-term effects of Edward's conquest. Edward's victory had long-term consequences for both England and Wales. The Welsh nobility was systematically replaced with English lords, who were granted lands and titles in the newly conquered territory. This not only weakened Welsh autonomy but also created tensions between native inhabitants and the new ruling class. Over time, resentment toward English rule grew, leading to continued uprisings and political instability. The integration of Wales into the English legal system. Edward sought to solidify his conquest by integrating Wales into the English legal framework. The Statute of Rhuddlan, 1284, established English governance in Wales, introducing English laws and administrative systems. Although some Welsh customs were retained, particularly in property disputes, the overarching goal was to ensure that English law took precedence. This legal restructuring set the foundation for future policies that would further incorporate Wales into the English kingdom. Long-term Welsh resistance and cultural resilience. Despite Edward's conquest, Welsh resistance persisted in various forms. Cultural resilience remained strong, with Welsh poets and bards preserving national identity through storytelling and music. The enforcement of English rule did not erase Welsh customs, and over time, nationalistic sentiments continued to develop, eventually leading to future uprisings, including the famous rebellion of Owain Glyndwr in the early 15th century. Additionally, Welsh laws and traditions, though suppressed, were kept alive through oral tradition and local customs, ensuring that the unique identity of Wales was not entirely lost. Edward I's conquest of Wales was a transformative moment in medieval British history. Although he achieved military success, his policies left a lasting legacy of bitterness and unrest. His strict governance and colonization efforts ensured English control, yet they also fueled continued Welsh resistance and the preservation of a distinct Welsh identity. The repercussions of his conquest shaped Welsh-English relations for centuries, leaving an enduring impact on the cultural and political landscape of Britain. Even centuries later, the Welsh people's sense of national identity remained strong, demonstrating the resilience of a culture that, despite military defeat, refused to be entirely extinguished. Edward's conquest of Wales was not merely a military endeavour but a political and cultural transformation that shaped the region's history for generations to come. Edward I's foreign policy and the unfulfilled Crusade ambitions. the crusading vow and its influence on European politics. Although Edward I never again embarked on a crusade after his return to England in 1274, his intention to do so significantly shaped his foreign policy for nearly 2 decades. In 1287, he took a solemn vow to lead another crusade, a commitment that guided his diplomatic and military strategies. His vision of a renewed European-wide crusade depended on stability among the great powers of the continent, as internal conflicts between European sovereigns would divert resources and attention away from the Holy Land. Edward sought to act as a mediator in European affairs, positioning himself as a leader in Christendom who could unify factions and direct their efforts towards reclaiming the Holy Land. One of the greatest obstacles to a unified Christian front was the ongoing rivalry between the Capetian House of Anjou, which controlled southern Italy, and the Crown of Aragon in Spain. This struggle intensified in 1282 with the outbreak of the Sicilian Vespers, when the citizens of Palermo revolted against Charles of Anjou and invited Peter III of Aragon to intervene. The subsequent war between France and Aragon threatened to escalate into a broader European conflict, jeopardizing any hopes of a crusade. Understanding the urgency of maintaining peace, Edward traveled to Paris in 1286, where he successfully brokered a truce between France and Aragon. This agreement secured the release of Charles of Anjou's son, Charles of Salerno, and temporarily averted a large-scale war. Despite Edward's diplomatic efforts, his crusading ambitions ultimately came to nothing. The final blow to his plans came in 1291 when the Mamluks captured Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. This event marked the effective end of the Crusader states and shattered any realistic hope of launching a new campaign in the near future. With the loss of Acre, Edward redirected his focus toward securing his own territories and strengthening England's position in continental affairs. Edward also sought papal support for his crusading ambitions, maintaining correspondence with Rome to secure spiritual and financial backing. However, the papacy, preoccupied with European disputes and its own consolidation of power, proved reluctant to commit significant resources to another crusade. The lack of unified support further diminished the feasibility of Edward's plans, leaving him unable to fulfill his oath. Edward I's rule in Gascony and the challenge of French overlordship. Edward was deeply involved in the administration of his Duchy of Gascony, a valuable yet precarious English possession within the French kingdom. His rule there was marked by repeated challenges to his authority and ongoing tensions with the French crown. To ensure effective governance, he assigned trusted officials such as Otto de Grandson and Chancellor Robert Burnell to investigate Gascon affairs. This inquiry led to the replacement of the Seneschal Luc de Tanny in 1278, reflecting Edward's commitment to maintaining stability and efficiency in the duchy. In 1286, Edward personally travelled to Gascony, where he remained for nearly 3 years to oversee the administration of his lands. His time there was marked by an extraordinary event in 1287 when he suffered a near-fatal accident. While standing in a tower, the floor collapsed beneath him, sending him plummeting 80 feet. He sustained a broken collarbone and was confined to bed for months. Several others did not survive the fall. Upon his recovery, Edward ordered the expulsion of the local Jewish population from Gascony, seemingly as a thank-offering for his survival. This act was consistent with his broader policy of expelling Jews from England in 1290, reflecting both personal piety and political considerations. The greatest challenge to Edward's rule in Gascony was the complex feudal relationship between the duchy and the French crown. As Duke of Gascony, Edward was a vassal of the French king, which often placed him in a subservient position in diplomatic affairs. In 1286, he had paid homage to the new French king, Philip IV, in recognition of this feudal bond. However, tensions escalated in 1293 when a dispute over piracy led to open hostilities between England and France. English, Gascon, Norman, and French sailors engaged in acts of maritime aggression, culminating in the English seizure of several French ships and the sacking of the port of La Rochelle. In response, Edward's brother, Edmund Crouchback, attempted to negotiate peace by allowing Philip IV to temporarily occupy Gascony's chief fortresses as a gesture of goodwill. However, Philip refused to relinquish control of these strongholds, effectively annexing Gascony. When Edward refused to appear before Philip in Paris to settle the matter, the French king formally declared the duchy forfeit. This act provoked Edward into a prolonged and costly war to reclaim his lost territories. Edward's difficulties in Gascony highlighted the limitations of England's position in France. His reliance on diplomacy, strategic marriages, and military alliances proved insufficient to counter Philip IV's expansionist policies. This struggle underscored the challenges of medieval kingship, where even the most powerful rulers had to navigate intricate feudal obligations. Edward's engagement with the Mongols. During this period, Edward maintained diplomatic communications with the Mongol Ilkhanate in Persia. These interactions had begun during his earlier crusade, when he explored the possibility of forming an alliance against their common Muslim enemies. Even after his return to England, he continued to correspond with the Mongol court in hopes of securing military cooperation for a future crusade. While residing in Gascony in 1287, Edward hosted Mongol envoys at his court. Among them was the Nestorian Christian monk Rabban Bar Soma, who recorded a detailed account of their meeting. This diplomatic exchange reaffirmed Edward's interest in Mongol-Christian relations and the potential for a joint campaign in the east. In 1289 and 1290, further Mongol embassies arrived in Europe with proposals from Ilkhan Abaka, offering to supply horses and support for a renewed Christian offensive in the Holy Land. Despite these overtures, Edward was unable to act on them. His financial and military resources were stretched thin by the conflicts in Gascony and Wales, and he lacked the necessary papal authorization to launch a new crusade. Nevertheless, his decision to send Geoffrey of Langley as an ambassador to the Mongols demonstrated his serious consideration of their proposals. The death of Eleanor of Castile and its impact on Edward. On the 28th of November, 1290, Edward suffered a profound personal loss when his beloved wife, Eleanor of Castile, passed away. Their marriage had been one of mutual affection and respect, and Edward remained devoted to her throughout their time together. Her death deeply affected him, and he expressed his grief through an extraordinary act of memorialization. Edward ordered the construction of 12 grand stone crosses, known as the Eleanor Crosses, to mark the locations where her funeral procession stopped on its journey from Lincoln to Westminster Abbey. These crosses, some of which still stand today, were among the most elaborate and enduring monuments of medieval England. His public display of mourning reinforced the image of Edward as a ruler who valued loyalty and personal devotion, traits that had defined his reign. The Anglo-French War and the Treaty of Montreuil. In 1294, the ongoing tensions between England and France erupted into war following a series of naval skirmishes between English and Norman privateers. Philip IV seized upon the opportunity to confiscate Gascony, forcing Edward to renounce his homage and declare war. The initial conflict in Gascony was followed by Edward's efforts to forge a broad coalition against France. Edward sought allies among the rulers of Europe, enlisting the support of the King of Germany, the Count of Flanders, and the Barons of Franche-Comté. Additionally, his son-in-laws, the Duke of Brabant and the Count of Bar-le-Duc, joined the English alliance. Edward's grand strategy was to stretch French forces by attacking on multiple fronts. His allies inflicted significant damage in Champagne, Burgundy, and other regions, disrupting Philip IV's ability to consolidate power. Edward I's later foreign policy was marked by his ambitions for another crusade, his struggles over Gascony, and his complex diplomatic engagements across Europe and beyond. His efforts ultimately shaped the balance of power on the continent. His military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, and ability to maintain alliances underscored his role as one of England's most influential monarchs. Though his crusading dreams never materialized, his legacy of political strategy and territorial ambition endured for generations. Great cause. By the 1280s, the relationship between England and Scotland was largely one of peaceful coexistence. Unlike in Wales, where the issue of homage was a source of contention, Scotland's position regarding homage to the English crown did not create as much controversy. In 1278, King Alexander III of Scotland formally paid homage to King Edward I of England. However, the nature of this homage was specific. Alexander acknowledged Edward only for the lands he held in England, rather than recognizing Edward as his feudal overlord for Scotland itself. This distinction kept relations relatively stable, as it allowed Scotland to maintain its independence while still acknowledging the superior power of England in a limited capacity. Background on Anglo-Scottish relations prior to the 1280s. The relationship between England and Scotland had historically been shaped by periods of both conflict and alliance. Earlier in the Middle Ages, the two nations had clashed over territorial disputes, but also engaged in intermarriages among their royal families to maintain diplomacy. The Treaty of Falaise in 1174 had placed Scotland under English overlordship after King William I of Scotland was captured at the Battle of Alnwick. However, the treaty was nullified in 1189 when Richard the Lionheart sold Scottish independence back to William to fund his crusades. This historical precedent of fluctuating power dynamics influenced later interactions between the two realms. Scotland's position as an independent kingdom was often tested by its more powerful southern neighbour. Although territorial disputes were common, trade between the two nations flourished, and cultural exchanges were frequent. The Scottish nobility often had ties to English landowners through marriage, and there were periods of mutual cooperation. However, the idea of English overlordship remained a sensitive issue, with Scottish kings maintaining their independence while acknowledging the influence of England in certain affairs. Political and economic landscape of Scotland in the late 13th century. During the late 13th century, Scotland was a prosperous kingdom with a strong feudal system. The nobility held extensive landholdings, and the economy was bolstered by trade with European countries such as France, Norway, and the Low Countries. Scottish towns like Berwick-upon-Tweed thrived as commercial centres, with merchants trading goods such as wool, hides, and fish. Scotland's economy was largely agrarian, with rural communities engaged in farming and livestock rearing. The nation's wealth allowed it to maintain a formidable military force, which consisted of both knights and common foot soldiers. Despite internal feudal rivalries, Scotland maintained a relatively stable governance structure under King Alexander III. His reign was marked by efforts to secure the kingdom's independence and prosperity, making his sudden death in 1286 all the more destabilizing. Under his rule, Scotland had enjoyed a period of relative peace and economic growth, and his ability to balance the interests of the nobility had helped maintain political stability. The succession crisis and Edward I's expanding influence. Tensions between the two nations began to surface following the death of Alexander III in 1286. His passing created a significant crisis in the Scottish succession, as his only surviving descendant was his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway. Since Margaret was still a child and unable to rule independently, Scottish leaders sought a diplomatic solution to ensure the kingdom's stability. In 1290, the Treaty of Bergen was agreed upon, stipulating that Margaret would marry King Edward's 6-year-old son, Edward of Carnarvon, the future Edward II of England. The treaty included specific provisions to safeguard Scotland's sovereignty, ensuring that despite the marriage alliance, Scotland would remain free of English overlordship. Unfortunately, the carefully arranged plan was never realized. In the autumn of 1290, the young Margaret set sail from Norway to Scotland to assume her role as queen, but during the journey, she fell ill and died in Orkney. Her unexpected death threw Scotland into a state of uncertainty and turmoil, as there was no clear heir to the throne. This situation led to the crisis known as the Great Cause, a contentious dispute over the Scottish crown. Edward I's policies toward other territories. Edward I had already demonstrated his ambition for expansion by subjugating Wales in 1282, installing English administration, and constructing massive castles to consolidate his rule. His conquest of Wales served as a template for his approach to Scotland. Viewing Scotland's instability as an opportunity, Edward sought to extend his authority over the northern kingdom as he had done with Wales. Edward's reputation as a strong and determined ruler had been built on his military successes and his ability to centralize power. His conquest of Wales had demonstrated his strategic acumen, and he sought to apply similar tactics in Scotland. However, unlike Wales, which had been a collection of smaller principalities, Scotland was a unified kingdom with a well-established monarchy and legal system. Edward's ambitions in Scotland would thus face stronger resistance. The Great Cause and Edward I's power play. 14 claimants put forward their cases for the Scottish throne. The two most prominent contenders were John Balliol and Robert de Brasse, 5th Lord of Annandale. The Scottish nobility, faced with a difficult decision, turned to King Edward I of England for assistance. The Scots did not ask Edward to act as an arbitrator with the authority to make a binding decision, rather, they sought his involvement only to oversee the process and ensure its proper administration. To determine the rightful heir, a panel of 104 auditors was established, 40 appointed by Balliol, 40 by Brasse, and 24 selected by Edward from among the senior figures of the Scottish political community. Edward, however, manipulated the proceedings to his advantage. He insisted that before he could settle the dispute, he had to be fully recognized as Scotland's feudal overlord. The Scottish leaders, wary of English domination, resisted this demand. They argued that without a king, no one in Scotland had the authority to make such a concession on behalf of the realm. However, Edward found a way to bypass this obstacle. He convinced the claimants to agree that Scotland would be placed under his direct authority until a rightful heir was determined. After extensive deliberations, a verdict was reached on the 17th of November, 1292, in favour of John Balliol. Balliol was crowned King of Scotland, but his reign would be overshadowed by Edward's continuous assertions of dominance. Despite his formal recognition as king, Balliol found his authority challenged at every turn by Edward, who treated him as a vassal rather than an independent monarch. The role of the Scottish Church in the crisis. The Scottish Church played a significant role in the unfolding conflict. Many clergy members resisted Edward's attempts to interfere with Scotland's sovereignty, rallying behind Balliol despite his weakened position. The Church's influence in Scottish politics and its alignment with nationalist sentiments helped fuel resistance against English encroachment. Scottish resistance and the Old Alliance. The breaking point came when Edward ordered the Scottish magnates to provide military service for his campaign against France. The Scots, unwilling to be drawn into England's conflicts, refused and instead sought an alliance with France, formalising the Old Alliance in 1295. Outraged by Scotland's defiance, Edward launched a full-scale invasion in 1296. His forces swiftly captured Berwick-upon-Tweed, a vital Scottish port town. The attack on Berwick was particularly brutal, with Edward's army massacring thousands of civilians in a show of force designed to intimidate the Scots into submission. Following this, at the Battle of Dunbar, the Scottish resistance was decisively crushed. The impact of Edward's policies. Edward I's actions in Scotland marked the beginning of a long and bitter conflict that would define Anglo-Scottish relations for generations. His aggressive policies not only alienated the Scots but also laid the foundation for the Wars of Scottish Independence. The resistance movement, spearheaded by figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, would transform the struggle into a full-scale war for national independence. Edward's heavy-handed tactics ultimately fueled Scottish nationalism and cemented Scotland's resolve to resist English domination for years to come. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious. King Edward I, a complex ruler of law and war. The temperament of a monarch. King Edward I of England, often referred to as Edward Longshanks, was known for his formidable personality and commanding presence. Historical records and anecdotes illustrate a ruler who was both feared and respected, his temperament veering between moments of extreme fury and instances of paternal gentleness. His reputation for a fierce and sometimes unpredictable temper is well documented. One particularly striking episode recounts how the Dean of St. Paul's, intending to challenge Edward over the heavy taxation policies imposed in 1295, collapsed and died upon encountering the king's presence. The sheer force of Edward's personality was enough to intimidate even those who occupied high religious and political offices. Similarly, a 14th-century chronicler attributed the death of Archbishop Thomas of York to the king's harsh treatment. This suggests that Edward's intensity in governance and personal interactions had real and dire consequences for those around him. His son, Edward of Carnarvon, experienced his father's fiery temper firsthand. When the young prince petitioned for an earldom on behalf of his favourite courtier, Piers Gaveston, Edward I reacted with an explosive display of rage, reportedly yanking out handfuls of his son's hair in anger. Such episodes contributed to the widespread perception of Edward as a fearsome and formidable ruler, particularly in his early years. During his reign, he was likened to a leopard in the Song of Lewis, written in 1264. At the time, Leopards were considered not only powerful but also unpredictable and aggressive, characteristics that seemed to align with Edward's approach to governance and warfare. Yet, despite his ferocity, Edward also demonstrated a softer side, particularly in his familial relationships. He was known to be deeply devoted to his large family, maintaining close ties with his daughters and showering them with lavish gifts whenever they visited court. This duality of nature, his capacity for both harshness and warmth, underscored the complexity of his character as a king. Edward's image as a ruler. Despite his sometimes severe demeanor, Edward was widely regarded as a capable and effective monarch. His English contemporaries did not necessarily love him, but they certainly feared and respected him. This is evidenced by the relative stability of his reign within England. Unlike other medieval kings, he faced no major armed rebellions against his authority. His ability to maintain order, even in a period marked by frequent military campaigns, suggests that his rule was strong and unchallenged domestically. However, Edward was not without his faults, and his propensity for vindictiveness and triumphalism has been criticized by historians. He relished the humiliation of his defeated enemies, frequently employing symbolic gestures to assert his dominance. For example, after the conquest of Wales in 1283, Edward confiscated sacred relics, including fragments of the Holy Cross. Similarly, following his victories in Scotland in 1296, he seized the Stone of Scone, an object of great national significance to the Scots, as well as their royal regalia. Such acts were designed not only to consolidate his rule but also to send a clear message of subjugation to those he had conquered. Edward's dealings with Wales and Scotland have led some historians to question his integrity and trustworthiness. There is evidence to suggest that he was capable of deceitful and manipulative behavior when it suited his political aims. His repeated breaches of agreements and his imposition of harsh conditions on his defeated foes point to a ruler who prioritized power over diplomacy. Historian R. Davies remarked that one of the most consistent and unappealing aspects of Edward's kingship was his tendency to belittle and humiliate his adversaries, reinforcing the perception of his reign as one of domination and coercion. A king of chivalry and faith. Despite his ruthlessness in political matters, Edward met the contemporary expectations of kingship in many respects. He was a skilled and determined soldier, embodying the chivalric ideals that were highly valued during the medieval period. His military campaigns, while often brutal, were conducted with a clear sense of strategy and purpose. Historian Michael Prestwich has argued that Edward's effectiveness as a ruler stemmed largely from his ability to balance martial prowess with administrative competence. Edward was also a deeply religious man, conforming to the spiritual norms of his era. He attended chapel services regularly and was known for his generous acts of almsgiving. He held a particular devotion to the Virgin Mary and St. Thomas Becket, two of the most venerated figures in medieval Christendom. Like his father before him, Edward participated in the royal touch ceremony, which was believed to cure those afflicted with scrofula, a disease commonly known as the king's evil. Records suggest that he touched upwards of 1,000 people each year in an effort to heal them, reinforcing his image as a divinely ordained ruler. However, despite his personal piety, Edward often found himself at odds with the Church. His relationships with the archbishops of Canterbury were frequently contentious, and his disputes with the papacy over ecclesiastical taxation were particularly notable. Edward saw the Church as a useful tool for governance and military mobilization, frequently leveraging religious institutions to justify his wars. He employed the clergy to disseminate pro-war propaganda, issuing writs to England's archbishops instructing them to promote his campaigns through sermons and prayers. Edward's architectural projects also had a propagandistic element. His construction of the Eleanor Crosses, a series of memorial monuments honoring his late wife, Eleanor of Castile, was not only an expression of grief but also a demonstration of royal authority and piety. These grand structures reinforced Edward's image as a devoted husband and Christian king, while simultaneously serving as visible reminders of his power. The Arthurian connection. Edward was fascinated by the legends of King Arthur, a figure who loomed large in medieval European imagination. Arthurian myths were widely popular during Edward's reign, and he actively engaged with them, seeking to draw connections between himself and the legendary king. In 1278, he made a notable visit to Glastonbury Abbey, where he ceremoniously opened what was believed to be the tomb of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere. The event was a carefully orchestrated display meant to associate Edward with the mythic legacy of Britain's greatest ruler. His interest in Arthurian lore extended beyond symbolic gestures. After his conquest of North Wales, Edward claimed to have recovered Arthur's crown from the Welsh prince Llewellyn ap Gruffydd. Additionally, his ambitious castle-building campaign in Wales incorporated Arthurian themes, strategically placing fortresses in locations tied to the legends. By doing so, Edward sought to weave himself into the fabric of British mythology, reinforcing his rule over the newly subjugated territories. Edward even staged grand events styled after Arthurian traditions. In 1284 and again in 1302, he hosted elaborate round-table tournaments, featuring jousting, feasting, and celebrations reminiscent of the legendary court at Camelot. Chroniclers of the time compared Edward's court to that of King Arthur, further legitimizing his reign in the eyes of his subjects. However, Edward's engagement with Arthurian myths was not purely driven by admiration for the tales. He also used them as a political tool, particularly in Wales, where the legend of Arthur's return was a powerful symbol of resistance against English rule. By co-opting the myths and positioning himself as Arthur's successor, Edward sought to undermine Welsh hopes of reclaiming independence. This strategic use of mythology exemplifies the calculated nature of Edward's kingship, his ability to manipulate cultural narratives to consolidate his authority. King Edward I was a monarch of great complexity, fierce yet familial, ruthless yet chivalric, deeply pious yet politically pragmatic. His reign was marked by military conquests, legal reforms, and a profound sense of personal authority. While his temper and harsh treatment of adversaries left a lasting impression, his ability to govern effectively ensured that he was respected, if not always loved, by his subjects. Edward's legacy endures as that of a formidable king whose reign shaped the course of English and British history in profound ways. Administration and the law under Edward I. The restoration of royal authority. Upon his ascension to the throne in 1272, Edward I undertook an ambitious campaign to restore royal authority and order following the turbulent reign of his father, Henry III. Edward recognized that the stability of his reign depended on effective governance, and he swiftly moved to reorganize and reform administrative structures. One of his first significant actions was the comprehensive overhaul of key administrative personnel, ensuring that those in positions of power were both loyal and competent. Among the most crucial of these appointments was that of Robert Burnell as Chancellor in 1274. Burnell, a trusted confidant of Edward, would go on to serve in this capacity until his death in 1292, shaping much of the legal and administrative landscape of the realm. Under Burnell's guidance, the administration was revitalized, and a more effective system of governance was implemented. That same year, Edward also replaced many local officials, particularly escheators and sheriffs. These changes were instrumental in preparing for a broader investigation into local governance and land ownership, which would play a central role in Edward's legislative reforms. Edward's determination to reinforce royal authority was evident in his dealings with the nobility. Many barons had accrued significant power during Henry III's reign, often ruling their estates with little regard for the king's authority. Edward aimed to reverse this trend and ensure that all lords were subject to the crown's oversight. His reforms sought to curb abuses by local officials while also reasserting royal prerogatives that had been eroded over time. This period of restructuring would define his rule and cement his reputation as a strong and capable monarch. The 100 Rolls and the inquiry into royal rights. One of the key initiatives launched early in Edward's reign was an extensive inquest into royal land and administrative abuses. This inquiry sought to address two primary concerns: the usurpation of royal lands and rights during Henry III's reign, and the misconduct of royal officials. The findings of this investigation were compiled into a set of census documents known as the 100 Rolls. These documents have often been compared to the 11th century Domesday Book due to their comprehensive nature and their significance in shaping subsequent legal proceedings. The 100 Rolls served as the foundation for a series of legal inquiries known as the Quo Warranto proceedings. The fundamental question posed in these inquiries was, by what warrant, Latin, quo warranto, were liberties and privileges held? The Crown asserted that unless an individual or institution could produce a royal license proving that their liberties had been granted by the King, those liberties should revert to the Crown. This argument was largely based on the legal doctrines of Henry de Bracton, a 13th-century legal scholar whose writings significantly influenced English law. Edward took these investigations seriously, personally overseeing aspects of the inquiries to ensure compliance. His approach was meticulous, with officials sent across the realm to collect evidence and record claims to various rights and privileges. The information gathered through the 100 Rolls allowed the Crown to take direct action against those who had unlawfully acquired lands or assumed privileges that did not have proper authorization. The results, though contentious, laid the groundwork for a more structured and accountable system of governance. The impact of the Quo Warranto proceedings. The Quo Warranto proceedings represented a direct challenge to the entrenched rights of the aristocracy. Many noble families and local officials had long exercised various liberties without explicit royal authorization, often relying on long-standing tradition as justification. Edward's legal challenge provoked considerable opposition among the aristocracy, who argued that continuous, uninterrupted use of privileges should be sufficient to establish legitimacy. In response to this backlash, a compromise was reached in 1290. Under this agreement, liberties that had been exercised since the coronation of Richard the Lionheart in 1189 were deemed legitimate. While this settlement limited the immediate gains Edward could make from the Quo Warranto proceedings, it nonetheless established a crucial precedent: all liberties ultimately derived from the Crown. This principle reinforced the notion of centralized royal authority, even if the practical gains in terms of land and privileges returned to the King were minimal. These legal disputes often created tensions between the monarchy and the nobility, leading to further negotiations and legal clarifications. Although Edward sought to limit baronial overreach, he was also pragmatic, understanding that outright confiscation of privileges could lead to rebellion. His ability to navigate these legal complexities demonstrated his political acumen and reinforced his reputation as a lawgiver. The legislative reforms of Edward I. The Quo Warranto proceedings were only one aspect of a broader program of legislative reform that characterized Edward I's reign. Edward was deeply committed to legal and administrative restructuring, recognizing that a well-defined legal framework was essential for effective governance. His legislative initiatives built upon earlier reform efforts, such as the Statute of Marlborough, 1267, which incorporated elements of the provisions of Oxford and the dictum of Kenilworth. One of the first major statutes issued by Edward was the First Westminster, 1275. This statute sought to assert royal prerogative by outlining restrictions on local liberties and reinforcing the authority of the monarchy. It was followed by the Statute of Gloucester, 1278, which further challenged baronial rights by reviving the system of general heirs, royal justices who travelled throughout the realm to hear cases, and significantly increasing the number of Quo Warranto cases being heard. Another important statute was the Statute of Mortmain, 1279, which addressed the issue of land grants to the Church. In an effort to curb the growing accumulation of land by religious institutions, often done to avoid feudal obligations. This statute restricted the ability of landowners to transfer property to the church without royal approval. By doing so, Edward ensured that land remained subject to feudal duties and that the Crown maintained control over land ownership. The Second Westminster, 1285, further expanded on previous legislative efforts. One of its most significant clauses, de donis conditionalibus, dealt with the settlement of land within families, ensuring that land granted with specific conditions remained within the designated lineage. This was crucial in regulating inheritance practices and preventing land from being freely alienated. Edward also sought to strengthen economic regulation through legislation such as the Statute of Merchants, 1285, which provided clear rules for the recovery of debts. This statute was instrumental in fostering commercial stability by ensuring that merchants had legal recourse in cases of unpaid debts. Additionally, Edward implemented the Statute of Winchester, 1285, which aimed to enhance law enforcement and local security. This statute reinforced the system of local policing, requiring communities to take collective responsibility for maintaining order and apprehending criminals. It also mandated regular mustering of able-bodied men to ensure they were prepared to respond to breaches of the peace. In 1290, Edward issued two critical statutes, Quo Warranto and Quia Emptors. While Quo Warranto focused on clarifying the legitimacy of liberties, Quia Emptors addressed disputes over land ownership. This statute sought to prevent the problematic practice of subinfeudation, in which landowners granted portions of their land to tenants who, in turn, granted it to others, leading to confusion over feudal obligations. By stipulating that all land sales had to be direct transfers, Quia Emptors simplified land tenure and reinforced feudal hierarchies. The end of the legislative era. The period of extensive legislative reform largely concluded with the death of Robert Burnell in 1292. Burnell had been a key figure in Edward's administration, playing a crucial role in drafting and implementing the statutes that defined this era. Without his guidance, the pace of legal innovation slowed, and Edward's focus increasingly shifted toward military campaigns and foreign policy. Nevertheless, the legal and administrative reforms enacted during Edward's reign had a lasting impact on English governance. His efforts to assert royal authority, standardize legal practices, and regulate land ownership laid the foundation for a more centralized and structured monarchy. Although he faced resistance from the nobility, Edward successfully reinforced the principle that all authority ultimately derived from the crown, a notion that would shape the development of English constitutional law in the centuries to come. Finances and Parliament under Edward I. Edward I's reign, 1272 to 1307, marked a significant period of financial and parliamentary reform, particularly in regard to the coinage system, taxation policies, and the evolution of parliamentary representation. These reforms were driven by the need to finance Edward's extensive military campaigns and the broader goal of centralizing and strengthening royal authority. The period saw an overhaul of the English monetary system, improvements in fiscal management, and the establishment of a parliamentary model that would influence future governance. Furthermore, these changes helped to stabilize the economy, maintain social order, and create a stronger foundation for future monarchs to govern effectively. The overhaul of the coinage system. By the time Edward ascended the throne in 1272, England's monetary system was in dire straits. The coinage in circulation was of poor quality, a problem that severely impacted trade and economic stability. Counterfeiting and coin clipping had also become rampant, leading to significant economic losses. In 1279, Edward initiated a sweeping reform of the coinage system, which involved the introduction of new coins of superior quality. These included the continued production of pennies, halfpennies, and farthings, as well as the introduction of a new denomination known as the groat. However, the groat failed to gain widespread acceptance, and its circulation remained limited. One of the major innovations during Edward's monetary reform was the improvement of the coin-making process. Traditionally, coins were stamped out from sheets of metal, but under Edward's reign, a more efficient method was introduced by the money William Turner Meyer. His method involved cutting blank coins directly from a silver rod before stamping them, which not only increased efficiency but also helped in maintaining uniformity in coin production. This method reduced wastage and ensured that coins had a consistent weight and value. Furthermore, Edward's reign saw significant changes in the administration of England's mints. Previously, coins bore the name of the money responsible for their production. However, Edward centralized the minting process under the Crown's authority, eliminating the need for individual moneyers' names on coins. This shift ensured greater control over the coinage and reduced instances of fraudulent minting. The king also implemented stricter oversight measures, appointing officials to inspect and regulate minting operations, thereby reducing corruption and mismanagement. Despite these improvements, counterfeiting remained a significant problem, particularly on the European continent. English coins were frequently counterfeited in regions such as the Low Countries, where their high silver content made them valuable. In response, Edward imposed a ban in 1283 to prevent the exportation of English coinage, though records indicate that these restrictions were often circumvented. The illegal trade of English currency abroad created ongoing challenges for the Crown, forcing Edward to take further legislative measures to punish offenders and restrict unauthorized minting. A critical measure taken by Edward to stabilize the currency was his decision in August 1280 to withdraw the old long cross coinage from circulation. This forced the population to transition to the newly minted currency, ensuring uniformity and eliminating the worn-out and clipped coins that had previously been in use. The success of these monetary reforms provided England with a more stable currency, facilitating trade and economic growth during Edward's reign. Merchants, both domestic and international, benefited from a more reliable monetary system, fostering economic expansion and strengthening England's position in European trade networks. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious. financing military campaigns, and fiscal policies. Edward I was a formidable military leader whose campaigns placed an immense financial burden on the kingdom. His military expeditions, particularly in Wales and Scotland, necessitated large sums of money, leading to the development of various financial strategies to fund these wars. These conflicts were crucial for the expansion of England's territorial control and the suppression of rebellious factions, but they also required a well-organized financial system to sustain them. One of the primary methods of raising funds was through taxation. Edward introduced lay subsidies, which were taxes levied on a fraction of the movable property owned by all non-clerical individuals. These subsidies were an essential source of revenue, helping to cover the costs of war. While previous monarchs had used such taxes sparingly, Edward increased their frequency and efficiency. Whereas Henry III, Edward's predecessor, had collected only 4 such subsidies during his reign, Edward successfully collected 9, reflecting his ability to harness financial resources more effectively. His ability to secure financial backing from his subjects demonstrated his political acumen and his understanding of the necessity of sustainable revenue streams for long-term military success. In addition to taxation, Edward secured revenue through customs duties. Wool was England's most valuable export, and in 1275, Edward negotiated an agreement with domestic merchants that imposed a permanent duty on wool exports. This duty provided a consistent and significant revenue stream for the crown. In 1303, he reached a similar agreement with foreign merchants, granting them specific rights and privileges in exchange for financial contributions. These agreements reinforced England's dominance in the wool trade, strengthening its economy and ensuring continued revenue flow to support military and administrative expenses. To further bolster his finances, Edward relied on Italian banking houses, particularly the Riccardi of Lucca. The Riccardi acted as moneylenders to the crown, managing the revenues from customs duties and providing loans to fund military campaigns. Their financial support was instrumental in sustaining Edward's wars in Wales. However, this relationship came to an abrupt end when war broke out between England and France. The French king confiscated the Riccardi's assets, leading to their bankruptcy and forcing Edward to seek alternative financiers. He subsequently turned to another prominent banking family, the Frescobaldi of Florence, who assumed the role of royal moneylenders and continued to support the crown's fiscal needs. The reliance on foreign bankers highlights the complexity of medieval finance and the necessity of international financial networks in supporting a powerful monarchy. Beyond seeking financial support externally, Edward also took steps to secure financial independence for his wife, Queen Eleanor. By allowing Eleanor to build her own income sources, Edward reduced the financial strain on the royal treasury and ensured that the Queen had an independent financial standing. Eleanor's estates and revenues contributed to the crown's wealth and provided her with the means to support charitable and administrative endeavours independently. The development of Parliament. Edward I is often credited with shaping the English parliamentary system in a way that would have lasting implications for governance. Throughout his reign, he convened Parliament regularly, utilizing it as a tool to legitimize taxation and implement policy decisions. By fostering a more inclusive and structured parliamentary system, Edward reinforced the legitimacy of royal decisions and facilitated broader political participation. One of the most significant developments occurred in 1295 when Edward summoned what would later be known as the Model Parliament. This assembly marked a turning point in parliamentary representation. Previously, the participation of commoners in Parliament had been sporadic and largely symbolic, with their role limited to assenting to decisions made by the nobility. However, in the 1295 Parliament, Edward included representatives from both the counties and boroughs. Specifically, 2 knights from each county and 2 representatives from each borough were summoned to attend. What distinguished the 1295 Parliament from its predecessors was the authority granted to these representatives. Rather than merely attending to listen and approve decisions, they were summoned with full authority, plenipotestas, to represent their respective communities. This meant that their assent to decisions carried the weight of their entire constituency, marking a shift towards a more representative form of governance. This shift laid the groundwork for the emergence of a structured parliamentary system that would continue to evolve in the following centuries. The significance of this development lay in its impact on taxation. By involving a broader spectrum of society in the decision-making process, Edward was able to secure widespread consent for lay subsidies. This legitimized his ability to levy taxes, ensuring that financial contributions were not seen as arbitrary impositions by the Crown but rather as collective decisions made in Parliament. The model parliament was a crucial step toward institutionalizing parliamentary governance and the eventual development of a constitutional monarchy. Edward I's reign was marked by significant financial and parliamentary developments that had lasting consequences for England. His overhaul of the coinage system ensured a more stable and reliable currency, facilitating trade and economic stability. The financial strategies he employed, including taxation, customs duties, and reliance on Italian bankers, allowed him to sustain his extensive military campaigns, although they also placed a heavy financial burden on the kingdom. Edward's reforms in Parliament laid the groundwork for a more representative system of governance, influencing the future structure of English politics and reinforcing the role of Parliament in decision-making. Parliament and the expulsion of the Jews. Edward I's policy towards the English Jewish community played a central role in shaping his financial dealings with Parliament until 1290. Unlike Christians, Jews were legally permitted to charge interest on loans, a practice known as usury. This distinction placed them in a unique economic position but also exposed them to hostility, particularly from the Christian Church, which grew increasingly intolerant of both Judaism and the practice of moneylending. Edward, like previous English monarchs, regarded Jews as his personal property, meaning he could tax them at will and utilize their financial services for his benefit. This legal status made them a primary target for royal taxation and manipulation, which contributed to their eventual expulsion. One of the major reasons for their persecution was the growing resentment over the transfer of wealth facilitated by Jewish moneylending. Many landowners borrowed money from Jewish lenders, and as a result, when they were unable to repay their debts, Jewish creditors could seize their land. To counter this, Edward's government heavily taxed the Jewish community, often forcing them to sell their debt bonds at significantly reduced prices. The Crown then acquired these debts, leading to vast transfers of land from indebted landowners to royal courtiers and even to Edward's own wife, Eleanor of Provence. This financial exploitation fostered widespread animosity towards both Jews and the Crown. In response to the mounting discontent in Parliament and among his subjects, Edward took legislative action against Jewish moneylending. In 1275, he issued the Statute of the Jury, which prohibited Jews from charging interest on loans. The statute aimed to compel them to adopt alternative professions, such as trade or agriculture, but these occupations were largely closed to them due to guild restrictions and societal prejudice. The statute effectively curtailed their main means of livelihood, further marginalizing the Jewish population. The economic straits in which the Jews found themselves only made them more vulnerable to further oppression by the Crown, which saw them as an increasingly expendable resource. By 1279, Edward intensified his efforts to undermine the Jewish presence in England under the guise of cracking down on illegal coin clipping, a practice whereby small amounts of precious metal were shaved off coins to be melted down and resold. While some Jews were indeed involved in this activity, it was also common among Christians, yet Edward used this as a pretext for widespread persecution. In that year, he ordered the arrest of all heads of Jewish households in England. The consequences were severe. Approximately 300 Jews, around 1/10 of the Jewish population in England, were executed. Others were forced to pay heavy fines to secure their release. The Crown seized property from those who were executed, raising at least £16,000 in the process. This crackdown signaled that Jews were increasingly being viewed not just as financial resources but as expendable scapegoats for economic and social unrest. Edward also attempted to pressure Jews into converting to Christianity. In 1280, he ordered that all Jews attend special sermons delivered by Dominican friars, with the hope that they would renounce their faith. However, these efforts met with little success. The Jewish community remained steadfast in their beliefs despite the pressures imposed upon them. As conversions were few and resistance remained strong, Edward's frustration with the Jewish population continued to grow, setting the stage for more drastic action against them. By this point, the financial utility of the Jewish population to the crown had been largely exhausted. They had been taxed and fined to such an extent that they were no longer a significant source of royal revenue. However, their continued presence in England remained a contentious issue and could still be used as a political bargaining chip. Edward recognized this and decided to use the fate of the Jewish community as a means to secure financial support from Parliament. As anti-Semitic sentiment grew among the populace, Edward found it politically expedient to expel the Jewish population altogether, presenting the measure as a moral and religious necessity rather than a financial maneuver. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion, formally expelling all Jews from England. The expulsion was framed as a moral and religious decision, with Edward claiming that it was done in honor of the crucified. However, the reality was that it was a political maneuver designed to secure a substantial financial grant from Parliament. In exchange for issuing the edict, Edward received a lay subsidy of £110,000, the largest amount granted in the medieval period. This substantial sum of money suggests that the expulsion was less about religious piety and more about political expediency and financial gain. Parliament saw the Jewish community as a disposable asset, and their removal became a means of consolidating control and wealth among the ruling elite. The expulsion itself was brutal and chaotic. Jewish families were given little time to arrange their affairs before being forced to leave the country. Many were dispossessed of their property and belongings, while others faced attacks during their departure. Some Jews perished in the October storms while crossing the Channel to France, and others fell victim to piracy. The crown seized Jewish property and redistributed it through a series of sales and grants, benefiting courtiers, royal officials, and members of the king's family. In total, 85 grants of Jewish property were made, further consolidating wealth within the royal court and rewarding Edward's supporters. The crown's confiscation of Jewish assets not only eliminated Jewish economic influence in England but also further entrenched the wealth of the ruling class, ensuring continued loyalty from those who benefited from the redistribution. The expulsion of the Jews from England was unprecedented in its permanence. While there had been previous, temporary expulsions of Jewish communities in various parts of Europe, the English expulsion marked the first time such a measure was enforced on a national scale without later reversal. The Jews were not officially allowed to return to England until the 1650s, during the rule of Oliver Cromwell. This long-standing exclusion solidified anti-Semitic policies and further embedded Jewish persecution in English society. Edward's rhetoric surrounding the expulsion reinforced anti-Semitic tropes that had been propagated by the Church and segments of English society. He accused the Jewish community of treachery and criminality, further justifying their removal. In an especially symbolic act, Edward contributed to the renovation of the tomb of little Saint Hugh, a child falsely claimed to have been ritually crucified by Jews. The tomb's design was made to resemble the Eleanor crosses, memorials dedicated to his late wife. By associating himself with this fabricated charge, Edward reinforced dangerous myths about the Jewish community and further legitimized their persecution. As historian Richard Stacey observes, a more explicit identification of the crown with the ritual crucifixion charge can hardly be imagined. The expulsion of the Jews from England was not merely an episode of religious intolerance but a calculated political move that reflected Edward's broader approach to governance. He used the Jewish community as a financial resource when it was convenient, then scapegoated and expelled them when it suited his political and fiscal needs. The expulsion served multiple purposes. It appeased the church, placated an increasingly anti-Semitic population, and provided Edward with much-needed funds. In doing so, he set a precedent for later medieval rulers who would use similar tactics to consolidate power and wealth at the expense of marginalized communities. The long-term consequences of Edward's actions were profound. England remained without a Jewish population for over 3.5 centuries, during which time anti-Semitic attitudes continued to fester. The memory of the expulsion shaped subsequent policies towards religious minorities, reinforcing a culture of exclusion and intolerance. Although the expulsion was eventually reversed, it left a lasting impact on England's social and economic landscape. In sum, Edward I's policies towards the Jewish population of England were driven by a combination of financial pragmatism, political calculation, and religious justification. While he initially exploited them for their financial resources, he ultimately sacrificed them to further his own power and secure funding from Parliament. The expulsion of the Jews in 1290 was not only a significant moment in English history but also a reflection of the broader medieval European trends of persecution and economic manipulation of minority communities. Administration in Ireland under Edward I. Edward I's administration in Ireland was shaped primarily by his strategic interests in utilizing the island as a resource base for his ongoing military campaigns in Gascony, Wales, Scotland, and Flanders. His governance focused on maximizing economic extraction to fund these wars, a policy that often led to the neglect of domestic administration and governance within Ireland. The impact of Edward's rule was felt across all aspects of Irish society, from the economic burdens imposed by heavy taxation to the lawlessness that emerged due to the absence of effective governance. His administration in Ireland was characterized by widespread corruption, weak institutional structures, increasing levels of disorder, and a growing cultural and political divide between the English-controlled areas and Gaelic Ireland. Economic exploitation and administration. Edward I saw Ireland not as a territory to be developed for its own sake but rather as a means of sustaining his military ambitions elsewhere. He sought to extract maximum economic value from the lordship of Ireland, directing its revenues toward his expensive campaigns on the continent and in Britain. Heavy taxation, forced levies, and purveyance, the forced purchase of goods and services for the Crown's use, drained the local economy. These measures placed a significant burden on both the Anglo-Irish settlers and the Gaelic population, many of whom were already struggling under existing feudal dues and obligations. Despite his aspirations for greater administrative efficiency, Edward's governance in Ireland suffered from severe corruption and mismanagement. His officials often acted with impunity, enriching themselves at the expense of the local population. Efforts at reforming the Irish administration after 1272, including attempts at improving record-keeping, largely failed due to systemic inefficiencies and entrenched corruption. The absence of a strong, centralized administration allowed local officials and lords to exercise disproportionate power, further weakening the effectiveness of royal governance. The inability to control the growing economic exploitation led to increased unrest among both settlers and the Gaelic population. Furthermore, the diversion of wealth from Ireland left many areas in financial distress. The Crown's lack of investment in the country meant that key agricultural areas suffered from underdevelopment, making Ireland a less productive economic centre than it could have been. This stagnation resulted in deteriorating living standards for the population, particularly among the peasantry, who bore the brunt of these exploitative policies. The deterioration of law and order. The lack of strong central authority in Ireland during Edward I's reign led to a significant increase in disturbances and lawlessness. Without effective oversight, factional disputes among the Anglo-Irish magnates intensified, leading to widespread instability. A major factor contributing to this disorder was the introduction of indentured military service among Irish magnates around 1290. This system allowed lords to maintain private armies, which they used to assert dominance over rivals, settle personal disputes, and resist royal authority when it suited them. The growing power of these private armies further eroded the Crown's control over Ireland and contributed to the breakdown of law and order. The weakening of law enforcement mechanisms was exacerbated by the funneling of Irish revenues toward Edward's wars. Essential infrastructure, including castles, bridges, and roads, fell into disrepair as funds that might have been used for maintenance were instead directed toward military campaigns in Wales and Scotland. The withdrawal of troops from Ireland to serve in these foreign conflicts further reduced the Crown's ability to maintain order, leaving large swathes of the countryside effectively ungoverned. The practice of granting pardons to criminals in exchange for military service in England further compounded the problem. This policy encouraged lawlessness, as individuals engaged in criminal activities with the expectation that they could later receive clemency by enlisting in the king's forces. The absence of meaningful consequences for violent and disruptive behavior led to a rise in banditry and feudal warfare, making travel and commerce increasingly perilous. Additionally, bands of disaffected soldiers, returning from Edward's campaigns, often turned to raiding and looting, further undermining stability. Economic consequences of military policies. The heavy financial and material demands placed on Ireland to support Edward I's wars had profound economic consequences. Forced purchases of supplies such as grain, known as prowesses, placed a severe strain on agricultural production. These policies often resulted in food shortages and inflated prices, which hit the lower classes particularly hard. Peasants and small landowners found themselves struggling to afford basic necessities as speculation drove up the cost of essential goods. Many were forced to abandon their land, leading to large tracts of once fertile farmland being left uncultivated. Additionally, the diversion of Irish resources to support foreign campaigns left the country unable to address its own economic and social needs. With the administration singularly focused on fulfilling Edward's war demands, investment in local governance, infrastructure, and economic development was neglected. The depletion of manpower due to the recruitment of soldiers for foreign wars further weakened Ireland's agricultural and economic stability, leading to periods of famine and hardship. These conditions were exacerbated by the continued imposition of levies and taxation, which placed additional pressure on already struggling communities. The resurgence of Gaelic Ireland. As the Anglo-Norman administration in Ireland weakened, Gaelic Ireland experienced a significant revival. The decline of English authority allowed Gaelic lords to reclaim lost territories and assert greater control over their lands. Many English settlers, left without effective protection from the Crown, assimilated into Gaelic society, adopting Irish customs, language, and legal traditions. This process, sometimes referred to as Gaelicization, saw former Norman lords integrate into Irish social structures, further eroding English influence. Edward's government viewed this resurgence with hostility. In 1277, the administration officially condemned Gaelic law as displeasing to God and to reason. This stance reflected the Crown's broader policy of trying to suppress Gaelic culture and maintain Anglo-Norman dominance over Ireland. However, in practice, the weakness of the lordship meant that such measures had little real impact. Gaelic customs, laws, and governance structures continued to flourish in many areas, particularly those beyond the reach of direct English control. Efforts to suppress Gaelic traditions only served to deepen resentment among the local population, further diminishing support for English rule. The 1297 Irish Parliament and efforts to restore order. By the late 1290s, the situation in Ireland had become increasingly dire. Recognizing the growing disorder, Edward's administration convened the Irish Parliament in 1297 in an attempt to address the crisis. This parliament sought to implement measures to counter the spread of Gaelic customs and law while also attempting to reassert royal authority over the increasingly lawless territory. However, the measures introduced by the 1297 Parliament largely failed to achieve their intended goals. The deep-seated economic and social issues afflicting Ireland could not be resolved through legislative action alone, particularly when the administration lacked the resources and manpower to enforce its decrees effectively. Many of the lands and villages that had been abandoned due to instability remained so, as there were neither incentives nor adequate protections to encourage resettlement and economic revival. The growing discontent among both Anglo-Irish and Gaelic factions ensured that opposition to English rule remained entrenched. Edward I's administration in Ireland was marked by widespread inefficiency, corruption, and neglect. While his primary interest in Ireland was as a resource base for his wars, his policies ultimately weakened English control over the island, allowing lawlessness and Gaelic resurgence to flourish. The excessive taxation, forced levies, and economic exploitation drained Ireland's resources while failing to provide the necessary governance and stability required for long-term prosperity. By undermining trust in English rule, Edward's policies contributed to the gradual erosion of the Crown's influence over Ireland, setting the stage for future conflicts. The failure to maintain essential infrastructure, enforce laws, and curb the power of private armies all contributed to the breakdown of effective rule. Edward's hostility toward Gaelic customs did little to prevent their resurgence, as the weakness of his administration rendered such policies largely ineffective. As a result, Ireland remained in a state of crisis, with widespread instability defining much of Edward I's rule and paving the way for further conflicts in the centuries to come. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious. Later reign, 1297 to 1307, constitutional crisis. During the late 13th century, King Edward I of England encountered mounting financial difficulties due to his unceasing military campaigns. These conflicts placed an enormous economic burden on his subjects, who struggled under the weight of escalating taxes. Before 1294, Edward had imposed only 3 lay subsidies, but between 1294 and 1297, he introduced 4 additional taxes, generating a sum exceeding £200,000. In addition to direct taxation, Edward's government relied on prizes, the compulsory seizure of commodities like wool and hides. Among the most detested levies was an additional duty on wool, infamously known as the moltolt, or unjustly taken, which further inflamed popular resentment. The king's relentless financial demands gradually provoked a strong wave of political resistance, setting the stage for one of the most turbulent periods of his reign. Clerical resistance and the papal bulls. Initially, opposition to Edward's fiscal policies emerged not from the lay population, but from the clergy. In 1294, Edward demanded that the church contribute half of its revenues to the crown. This unprecedented requisition met resistance, yet Edward swiftly responded by threatening rebellious clergy with outlawry. Faced with little alternative, they ultimately conceded to his demands. At this juncture, Robert Winchelsea, who had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, was in Italy awaiting papal consecration. Upon returning to England in January 1295, he found himself compelled to approve another significant grant to the king later that year. However, the situation changed dramatically in 1296 when Pope Boniface VIII issued the papal bull Clericis Laicos, a decree forbidding clergy from paying taxes to secular rulers without papal authorization. English clergymen, invoking this directive, refused Edward's demands. The king retaliated by declaring them outlaws, stripping them of royal protection. This placed Winchelsea in an acute dilemma. He had to choose between loyalty to the Pope or submission to the English crown. He opted for a compromise, allowing each clergyman to decide individually whether to comply. The crisis was alleviated toward the end of 1296 when Boniface issued a new bull, Et si de statu, which permitted clerical taxation in cases of urgent necessity. This granted Edward a means to continue extracting revenue from the clergy despite earlier opposition. The growing resistance of the nobility. Opposition from the lay nobility took longer to materialize, but when it did, it proved equally formidable. The most contentious issue centered on Edward's authority to summon military service and his unilateral taxation practices. In February 1297, at the Salisbury Parliament, Roger Bigod, the 5th Earl of Norfolk, boldly challenged the king's demand for military service. He insisted that his obligations extended only to fighting alongside the king, and he refused to accept orders to serve abroad in Edward's absence. Specifically, he contended that if Edward intended to lead a campaign in Flanders, he could not simultaneously command his subjects to fight in Gascony. By mid-1297, Bigod had allied with Humphrey de Bohun, the 3rd Earl of Hereford and Constable of England. Together, they composed a formal list of grievances known as the Remonstrances, voicing their strong opposition to the king's excessive taxation and military conscription policies. Their resistance emboldened others, leading to a broader noble opposition to Edward's increasingly autocratic rule. Confrontation and compromise. Undeterred, Edward pressed forward with his fiscal demands, requesting yet another lay subsidy. However, this time he bypassed the full parliament and sought approval from only a select group of nobles. This exclusive decision-making process incensed the broader nobility and further fueled the growing unrest. While Edward focused on preparing for his military campaign in Flanders, Bigod and de Bohun took decisive action by confronting officials at the Exchequer, effectively halting the collection of the new tax. At this point, England stood on the brink of internal conflict. With Edward abroad and his military forces significantly depleted, tensions escalated to the verge of civil war. However, an external crisis intervened. In September 1297, the Scots dealt a severe blow to the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Faced with a renewed Scottish threat, Edward and his nobles found common cause. To mend relations and secure support for his impending Scottish campaign, Edward issued the Confirmatio Cartarum, a significant reaffirmation of both the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. This decree formally acknowledged the principle that taxation required broad consent, thereby placating many of his discontented barons. Continued political struggles. Despite the fragile peace achieved in 1297, Edward's difficulties with his barons and clergy persisted into the early 14th century. Repeatedly, he was called upon to honor the commitments he had made in the Confirmatio Cartarum. Of particular concern was his promise to uphold the Charter of the Forest, a document designed to limit royal encroachment on vast tracts of common land. In 1301, Parliament pressured Edward to conduct a comprehensive review of the royal forests, compelling the king to make further concessions. However, in 1305, he successfully obtained a papal bull that released him from these promises, once again demonstrating his reluctance to relinquish control over key resources. The decline of opposition. Ultimately, it was not concessions but a shift in key political figures that weakened resistance to Edward's rule. The movement against him lost momentum following the deaths of influential figures. Humphrey de Bohun passed away in 1298 after returning from Scotland, removing one of the primary leaders of the noble opposition. In 1302, Roger Bigard reached a personal accord with Edward, securing his financial future by agreeing to make the king his heir in exchange for an annual grant. This effectively neutralized his opposition. With these figures pacified or gone, resistance to Edward's fiscal and military policies significantly diminished. Edward also exacted retribution on Archbishop Winchelsea, who had remained steadfast in opposing clerical taxation. When Clement V was elected pope in 1305, he proved more amenable to Edward's influence. Under Edward's urging, Clement suspended Winchelsea from office, eliminating one of the strongest voices against royal taxation of the Church. Edward's legacy, governance, and constitutional change. As Edward's reign drew to a close, he had largely succeeded in consolidating his authority, albeit at significant political and social costs. His relentless pursuit of taxation and his demands for military service had deeply strained relations between the monarchy and both the clergy and the nobility. Though he managed to secure short-term compliance through calculated concessions and strategic political maneuvering, the grievances of his opponents remained unresolved. The conflicts that defined his later reign foreshadowed the continuing struggle between the English monarchy and Parliament over taxation and governance. Edward's financial policies and his resistance to noble and clerical opposition laid the groundwork for constitutional changes in England. His methods of revenue extraction, his suppression of dissent, and his political compromises all contributed to an evolving legal framework that gradually defined the rights of both monarchs and subjects. Though Edward successfully reasserted royal authority, his reign left behind a legacy of unresolved tensions that would resurface in subsequent generations. His efforts to finance his military ambitions and enforce his authority set a precedent for future English rulers. By the time of his death in 1307, England had experienced a decade of constitutional crises that helped shape the nation's political landscape for centuries to come. Return to Scotland, resistance, conquest, and rebellion. The unfinished conquest and early resistance. Edward I of England believed that his conquest of Scotland was complete when he left the country in 1296, following his overwhelming victory over John Balliol and the submission of the Scottish nobility. However, this assumption proved to be premature, as discontent and defiance quickly began to resurface across Scotland. Andrew de Murray in the north and William Wallace in the south spearheaded a growing resistance movement, rallying forces against the English occupation. These leaders were determined to reclaim Scottish independence, and their efforts led to one of the most famous confrontations in medieval Scottish history. On September 11, 1297, the Scottish forces, led by Wallace and Murray, achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Despite being outnumbered, the Scots utilized superior tactics and knowledge of the terrain to decimate the English army commanded by John de Warenne, the 6th Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham. The bridge itself became a bottleneck, preventing the English forces from effectively deploying their superior numbers, leading to a crushing defeat. The loss sent shockwaves throughout England, forcing Edward to take immediate action. Edward's retaliation and the Battle of Falkirk. Determined to restore English dominance, Edward returned from his military campaigns in Flanders and marched north to retaliate. On July 22, 1298, he faced Wallace's forces at the Battle of Falkirk. Unlike Stirling Bridge, this engagement saw the English emerge victorious. Edward's army, composed of heavily armed cavalry and skilled longbowmen, overwhelmed the Scottish formations. Wallace's schiltrons, tightly packed defensive units of spearmen, proved ineffective against the relentless English archers. The Scots suffered heavy losses, and Wallace was forced into hiding, resigning as Guardian of Scotland soon after. Despite this significant victory, Edward failed to secure complete control over Scotland. By 1299, Scottish forces had regrouped, and under new leadership, they successfully recaptured Stirling Castle, demonstrating that resistance remained resilient. Edward continued to campaign in Scotland over the next few years, capturing strategically vital locations, including Culliverick Castle in 1300. However, the Scots avoided direct confrontations, instead opting for guerrilla-style warfare, conducting raids and striking at English supply lines. Diplomatic maneuvers and the fall of Wallace. Recognizing the need for external support, the Scots turned to the Pope for intervention. In 1301, Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal bull urging Edward to recognize Scottish sovereignty. This request was rejected by the English crown, as reflected in the Baron's Letter of 1301, which asserted England's rights over Scotland. By 1303, the geopolitical landscape shifted when England secured a peace agreement with France, effectively isolating Scotland diplomatically. With this advantage, Edward launched another campaign, systematically subjugating Scottish strongholds. In 1304, many of the Scottish nobles, including Robert the Bruce, pledged their allegiance to Edward. The final blow to the Wallace-led resistance came in 1305 when he was betrayed by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith. Captured and transported to London, Wallace was charged with treason and subjected to a brutal execution. His public death was meant as a warning to other rebels, but instead, it cemented his status as a national martyr. The rise of Robert the Bruce and renewed rebellion. Although Wallace's execution seemed to mark the end of organized resistance, the struggle for Scottish independence was far from over. In a dramatic turn of events, Robert the Bruce, who had previously sworn loyalty to Edward, shifted his allegiance and took a bold step toward reclaiming Scotland. On February 10, 1306, he murdered his rival, John Comyn, at a church in Dumfries, eliminating a major obstacle to his ambitions. A few weeks later, on March 25, 1306, he was crowned King of Scotland, openly challenging English authority. Bruce's actions triggered an immediate response from Edward. Too weak to lead an army himself, Edward delegated command to his trusted generals, including Aymer de Valence, the 2nd Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Percy, the 1st Baron Percy. The English response was swift. On June 19, 1306, Bruce suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Methven, forcing him into hiding. English forces systematically recaptured territories and executed Bruce's allies, reinforcing Edward's iron grip over Scotland. Brutal reprisals and the turning tide. Edward's suppression of Bruce's rebellion was marked by extreme brutality. Bruce's family and supporters faced gruesome fates. His sister, Mary, was imprisoned in a cage at Roxburgh Castle for 4 years, while Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, who had played a crucial role in Bruce's coronation, was similarly held at Berwick Castle. Bruce's younger brother, Neil, was captured and executed through hanging, drawing, and quartering, a particularly gruesome punishment. Edward no longer regarded the conflict as a war between nations but as a rebellion requiring ruthless suppression. However, rather than crushing the Scottish resistance, these brutal reprisals strengthened Bruce's support. Many Scots who had been reluctant to oppose Edward now rallied behind Bruce. Using guerrilla tactics, Bruce evaded capture and began reclaiming key territories. His growing reputation as a leader committed to Scottish independence galvanized further resistance. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious. Edward's final campaign and death. Despite his declining health, Edward remained determined to crush the rebellion. In 1307, he launched another campaign, but his body was failing him. On July 7, 1307, he died near Borough by Sands, just south of the Scottish border. His last wish was for his body to be carried into battle against the Scots, symbolizing his undying resolve to subjugate Scotland. However, his death marked a significant turning point. His son, Edward II, who inherited the throne, lacked his father's military acumen and determination, providing an opportunity for Bruce to advance his campaign. The legacy of the Scottish resistance. With Edward I's death, Bruce seized the opportunity to strengthen his position. Over the next several years, he led a series of successful campaigns, reclaiming territory and solidifying his reign. The turning point came in 1314 at the Battle of Bannockburn, where Bruce decisively defeated the English forces, securing his position as Scotland's legitimate king. Edward I's campaign in Scotland, though initially promising, ultimately failed to achieve complete subjugation. His reliance on military force and brutal suppression methods alienated the Scots rather than breaking their spirit. The continued resistance of Wallace and the strategic cunning of Bruce ensured that Scotland would not remain under English control indefinitely. Edward's enduring impact. Edward's legacy in Scotland was one of both conquest and failure. While he had temporarily imposed English rule, his heavy-handed tactics ultimately fueled greater Scottish nationalism. His inability to completely subjugate Scotland demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Scottish people. His policies, particularly his execution of Wallace and his treatment of Bruce's family, had unintended consequences, solidifying opposition rather than quelling it. Although Edward's death in 1307 marked the end of his direct involvement, the war for Scottish independence continued. The guerrilla warfare tactics employed by the Scots, the shifting allegiances of key nobles, and the perseverance of leaders like Wallace and Bruce contributed to the prolonged struggle. In the end, Edward's legacy in Scotland was one of unfinished conquest, as his long war failed to bring about the absolute control he had sought. Instead, it laid the foundation for an enduring Scottish identity and ultimately, an independent Scotland. Death and burial of Edward I. The final campaign and failing health. By the beginning of 1307, Edward I was an aging and ailing ruler, yet he remained determined to continue his military campaigns against Scotland. Despite his declining health, he prepared to advance against the persistent resistance led by Robert the Bruce. Bruce had consolidated power, gathered an army, and achieved a critical victory at the Battle of Loudoun Hill in May 1307, where he defeated Aymer de Valence, one of Edward's key commanders. This defeat only hardened Edward's resolve to personally lead another campaign to crush Scottish resistance once and for all. Though he had already begun to show signs of serious illness, Edward summoned his strength and set out toward the Scottish border. However, the strain of the journey proved overwhelming. While traveling north, he succumbed to dysentery, a common affliction that had plagued medieval armies. His condition worsened rapidly, and by the time he reached Borough by Sands on July 6, 1307, he was gravely ill. The following morning, as his attendants attempted to lift him to help him eat, the formidable king who had waged decades of war died in their arms. His passing marked the end of an era of military conquest and monarchical authority unmatched in England's medieval history. Edward's deathbed wishes and succession. Various accounts emerged about Edward's final moments and his last wishes. One widely cited legend claims that he requested that his heart be taken to the Holy Land, leading an army on yet another crusade against the infidels. Another version suggests he wished for his bones to be carried north with English armies so he could still be present in spirit for future battles against the Scots. While these accounts are speculative, a more credible version is found in contemporary records. Edward, in his final hours, gathered his closest advisors and entrusted them with the care of his son and heir, Edward II. Edward I's primary concern in his last moments was the stability of his kingdom. He reportedly issued a final order ensuring that Piers Gaveston, a controversial noble he had exiled earlier that year, should not be allowed to return to England. Edward I feared that Gaveston's influence would undermine his son's rule. However, his son, Edward II, quickly disregarded this order upon his ascension, recalling Gaveston from exile almost immediately. This act of defiance foreshadowed the turbulent reign that would follow, characterized by favoritism, political strife, and eventual rebellion. The journey south and state funeral. Edward I's body was carefully transported south, passing through various religious sites where he was honored with prayers and ceremonies. His remains were placed in state at Waltham Abbey, a prestigious and sacred location. Despite his legendary status as a warrior king, records of his funeral remain sparse. The total expenditure for the ceremony amounted to approximately £473, a substantial sum for the period, but modest for a monarch of his stature. It remains unclear whether the restrained nature of the ceremony was due to financial limitations or a deliberate reflection of Edward's practical and militaristic personality. Edward was eventually interred at Westminster Abbey on October 27, 1307. His tomb was surprisingly unadorned, constructed from Purbeck marble and lacking the elaborate effigy typically seen on royal burials. Historians debate the reasoning behind this simplicity. Some suggest it was a reflection of his pragmatic character, while others speculate that England's drained resources, due to decades of war, played a role in the austere design. Tomb investigations and physical stature. Centuries later, in 1774, the Society of Antiquaries of London opened Edward's tomb for study. Inside, they discovered that his body had been remarkably well preserved after nearly 470 years. One of the most intriguing findings from the examination was confirmation of Edward's height. The king had been famously tall, earning him the moniker Longshanks. His skeletal remains confirmed that he stood around 6 feet 2 inches, an exceptional height for the medieval period. The inscription and hammer of the Scots. Edward's tomb bore a Latin inscription that read, Edwardus primus Scotram malleus hic est, 1308. Pactum serva, translated as Here is Edward I, hammer of the Scots, 1308. Keep the trough. This inscription symbolized his relentless pursuit of Scottish subjugation and his vow to avenge defiance, particularly from Robert the Bruce. However, the title Hammer of the Scots was not a contemporary designation. The epithet was likely added in the 16th century by John Feckenham, the last abbot of Westminster. Despite this, it became permanently associated with Edward I's legacy, portraying him as the unyielding force that sought to bring Scotland under English rule. Edward's death and its impact on Scotland. Edward I's death dramatically shifted the balance in the ongoing English-Scottish conflict. While his military campaigns had placed immense pressure on Scotland, he had failed to fully conquer the country. His son and successor, Edward II, lacked the strategic mind and leadership qualities of his father. Consequently, the war against Scotland entered a new phase that would ultimately favour Robert the Bruce. Freed from Edward I's unrelenting military campaigns, Bruce seized the opportunity to solidify his rule. He reorganised Scottish forces, reclaimed lands, and launched a series of successful campaigns that culminated in a defining moment, the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. The overwhelming Scottish victory ensured Bruce's status as the rightful ruler of Scotland and secured the country's independence for the foreseeable future. This major event underscored the ultimate failure of Edward I's long-term goal to subjugate Scotland under English rule. Edward's legacy: warrior, reformer, and conqueror. Edward I is remembered not only for his military conquests but also for his significant contributions to England's legal and administrative systems. His reign saw the introduction of key legal reforms that shaped English common law, many of which had lasting influences on governance and legal traditions. However, his campaigns in Wales and Scotland, as well as his participation in European conflicts, defined much of his legacy. His war efforts against Scotland remain one of the most discussed aspects of his rule. While his victories demonstrated his formidable strategic acumen, his brutal policies and harsh treatment of Scottish leaders only strengthened resistance rather than securing submission. The execution of William Wallace and the aggressive crackdowns against Robert the Bruce's supporters fueled the very defiance that Edward sought to eliminate. His death came at a time when his conquests remained incomplete, and his son's inability to maintain his military legacy only accelerated England's loss of control over Scotland. Conclusion: the end of a monarch, the continuation of conflict. Edward I's death in 1307 marked the end of an era of military dominance, but his ambitions lived on in the policies he had set in motion. Though his efforts to fully conquer Scotland failed, his legacy as a warrior king remains one of the most enduring in British history. His title as the Hammer of the Scots, whether contemporary or not, symbolizes the relentless nature of his campaigns, his determination to expand English power, and his belief in an unshakable monarchy. Ultimately, his passing allowed Scotland the breathing room it needed to fight for and secure its independence. Edward's death was not just the conclusion of a powerful reign, it was the turning point that allowed the Scots, under Bruce's leadership, to achieve a decisive victory against English rule. His tomb at Westminster Abbey remains a solemn tribute to a monarch whose influence on British history endures to this day. Legacy of Edward I. Early histories and perceptions. The first recorded histories of Edward I emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries. These accounts primarily relied on chronicles of the time rather than official records, offering general assessments of Edward's reign. Chroniclers frequently praised his accomplishments, depicting him as a powerful and authoritative ruler who strengthened the English crown. In the 17th century, legal scholar Sir Edward Coke described Edward as the English Justinian, likening him to the Byzantine Emperor Justinian I, who was renowned for his legal reforms. This comparison underscored Edward's contributions to English law and governance. As historical analysis evolved, scholars began to scrutinize Edward's reign in relation to the changing role of Parliament and the monarchy, drawing parallels to the political struggles of their own time. 18th and 19th century evaluations. By the 18th century, historians increasingly viewed Edward I as a skilled yet ruthless monarch. He was portrayed as a leader shaped by the demands of his era, someone who acted decisively when necessary. William Stubbs, a highly influential Victorian historian, argued that Edward played a crucial role in shaping English governance, particularly in advancing legal institutions and parliamentary practices. According to Stubbs, Edward's leadership set the foundation for England's later constitutional monarchy. Stubbs' student, Thomas Tout, initially supported this perspective but later revised his opinion after extensive research into Edward's court and household. Tout came to believe that Edward was a pragmatic ruler who used Parliament strategically, employing it as a tool to curb the power of the nobility while bolstering his own authority. 20th and 21st century perspectives. Modern historians have continued to reassess Edward I's reign, recognizing it as a pivotal period in medieval England. While some scholars hail him as one of the greatest medieval kings, they often contrast the effectiveness of his early reign with the difficulties of his later years. G. Templeman, in his 1950 historiographical essay, asserted that Edward deserves a high place in the history of medieval England. Over the past century, 3 major academic biographies have shaped contemporary understanding of his reign. F. M. Powick's volumes from 1947 and 1953 became standard references, offering a largely positive assessment of Edward's reign. Powick praised his legal achievements and commitment to justice. In 1988, Michael Prestwich published a comprehensive biography, focusing on Edward's political career. While still portraying him favorably, Prestwich acknowledged the king's policy failures and their long-term consequences. In contrast, Mark Morris's 2008 biography provided a more critical portrayal, exploring Edward's character flaws and emphasizing his role in persecuting England's Jewish community. Morris's work highlighted the darker aspects of Edward's rule, including policies that modern scholars condemn as deeply discriminatory. Debates on Edward's kingship. Scholars have long debated Edward I's leadership, questioning whether his reign was characterized by collaboration or oppression. Michael Prestwich attempted to evaluate him by the standards of his time, acknowledging his strengths while critiquing his political insensitivity. Fred Kazel concurred, arguing that Edward lacked diplomatic subtlety and often relied on sheer force to achieve his objectives. Prestwich ultimately concluded that Edward was a formidable king, whose reign was both significant and deeply complex. G. W. S. Barrow took a different stance, arguing that Edward fell short of the moral standards of his time. He described Edward as a leader driven by personal ambition, frequently displaying a vindictive nature. John Gillingham further developed this perspective, labeling Edward as an effective bully, but recognizing his immense impact on Britain's political landscape. Andrew Spencer and Caroline Burt provided an alternative view in 2014, reassessing Edward's role in constitutional reform. They described him as a creative and determined ruler who acted with a strong sense of moral purpose. Colin Veitch, however, raised the question of whether Edward's subjects in Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and the Jewish community would have shared such a positive evaluation of his rule. Differing views in England and Scotland. English and Scottish historians offer vastly different interpretations of Edward I's legacy. G. W. S. Barrow accused Edward of exploiting Scotland's leaderless state to establish English supremacy, reducing Scotland to a vassal kingdom. He argued that Edward's repeated miscalculations of Scottish resistance fueled deep-seated animosities that lasted for centuries. Michael Brown, however, suggested that Scottish independence was not inevitable. Edward's military campaigns could have succeeded had he approached the situation differently. Welsh historians, meanwhile, view Edward's conquest of Wales as a devastating blow to Welsh culture and identity. Arthur Davies described Edward's methods as colonialist, likening them to apartheid-style governance that marginalized native Welsh society. John Davies echoed this sentiment, noting the hostility faced by Welsh people under English rule. While Edward made some efforts to incorporate the Welsh into his administration, historians argue that these measures were insufficient to repair the damage caused by his conquests. Irish historians also regard Edward I's reign as a turning point in their history. James Lydon argued that Edward's use of Irish resources to finance his wars weakened the lordship of Ireland, while his failure to maintain stability allowed Gaelic forces to regain strength. These conflicts would contribute to prolonged unrest in Ireland, further complicating English rule. Edward I's treatment of the Jewish community. Edward's actions toward England's Jewish population remain one of the most contentious aspects of his reign. Barry Dobson suggested that this aspect of Edward's rule has become increasingly relevant to modern audiences. In 1290, Edward issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering the forced removal of all Jews from England. Historians such as Colin Richmond and Robert Stacey describe this policy as state-sponsored anti-Semitism. While anti-Semitic sentiments had existed in England prior to Edward's reign, scholars argue that he was the first English monarch to implement an official policy of persecution against the Jewish community. Paul Hyams and Robert Moore have examined the role of the Church in shaping Edward's attitudes toward Jewish subjects, suggesting that religious leaders encouraged his actions rather than these policies stemming from widespread popular prejudice. Many scholars believe that Edward's financial motivations played a significant role in the expulsion, as Jewish moneylenders had been heavily taxed and exploited by the crown. With debts mounting and Parliament demanding further restrictions, Edward ultimately chose expulsion as a politically expedient solution. This decision solidified long-term English anti-Semitism, shaping attitudes for centuries to come. Edward's family and succession. Edward I had a large family, fathering at least 14 children, possibly 16, with his first wife, Eleanor of Castile. Of these, only 5 daughters and 1 son survived into adulthood. His only surviving male heir, Edward II, ascended the throne upon his father's death in 1307. Edward II's reign, however, proved to be tumultuous. His reliance on Piers Gaveston and subsequent political struggles led to widespread discontent, setting the stage for rebellion and his eventual deposition. Conclusion: a complex and divisive legacy. Edward I's legacy remains a topic of intense debate. While many historians acknowledge his contributions to English law, governance, and military expansion, his methods have been criticized as harsh and often repressive. His campaigns in Wales and Scotland left lasting scars, while his expulsion of the Jewish community solidified patterns of discrimination. Although admired for his strategic acumen and legislative achievements, his reign also exemplified the limitations of medieval kingship, where force and coercion often took precedence over diplomacy and compromise. Despite these contradictions, Edward I's impact on Britain and Ireland was profound. His policies shaped the trajectory of medieval England, strengthening the monarchy while fostering resistance among the nations he sought to control. Whether viewed as a visionary leader or a ruthless conqueror, Edward I's reign remains one of the most defining periods in English medieval history. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.